Good evening, friends. Welcome to Life with God. In this season, we study the topic of God as presence and the concept of presence. And in episode 4 of this program, we have invited Dr. Oliver Glanz to join us for this conversation. Dr. Oliver Glanz is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Andrews University, and I'm delighted that he is a second time as part of the program Life with God. Welcome, Oliver.
Thanks, Adelina.
Also part of the discussion, we have Hobby returning after some absence. Glad to see you, Hobby. And we also have Joseph returning. Welcome. Adrian, for the first time joining us this evening. Thank you for participating. For the first 5 minutes of the discussion, we will take some time to learn a few things about our guest. If you were a color trio, what colors would you be?
A colored trio. Well, my favorite colors have been blue, green, and then I didn't have a third one, but probably red because it's so passionate. Probably these three colors: blue, green, red.
How many times have you moved houses in your life?
I have been a pastor's kid. And back then you had to move like every 6 years about. So that was probably 4 times or 5 times I've moved with my parents. 4 times, I think. And then I myself moved to, I don't know, perhaps 12 times or so.
That's a lot. Next question. If you could gain any skill in the blink of an eye, what would it be?
Skill. So
S-K-I-L-L.
scale?
Skill, yes.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Okay, good. I think probably carpentry.
Yeah. Are you a morning person or a night owl?
It completely depends. So sometimes I can wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and get very productive and work, and sometimes the moments of inspiration take place at 1 o'clock at night. So I'm unpredictable when it comes to that. Yeah.
If your house caught fire, God forbid, and your family is safe, what 3 objects would you try to rescue?
I think I wouldn't think about what I would rescue. I think I would just go out. So I think the most important would be to keep my memories in my mind. So
okay.
Yeah.
Why did you choose to be an Old Testament professor versus New Testament or homiletics?
Well, actually, I didn't choose to become an Old Testament professor, really. So it was never my plan, never my dream. I never felt a calling for it. So if I felt a calling in my life for something, it was to become a high school teacher for the subjects history, literature, and philosophy. So, and I happen to teach something quite similar right now here at the seminary. So I feel like I'm at a good place.
What's your main motto for life?
I think to live a meaningful life. That's probably the motto, to live a meaningful life. Yeah.
Has a student ever posed a question that has challenged your faith?
Perhaps not in that way. That is, I have not yet experienced that. But what I've experienced is that a question of a student has been my own question in a previous period that really challenged my my faith. So in that sense, might not have been challenged at the spot, but that very question has challenged me previously. So usually these situations create a lot of sympathy because I feel like, hey, this is my biography. This is a question that I also struggled with. Yeah.
If you were a water form, what would you be?
I think glacier water.
Okay.
Water that just moved away from its ice state or from its solid state into a fluid state, but it's not really fluent yet. So it's still chilly. So I think that's the type of water I can relate to best.
Well, speaking of water, do you prefer swimming or cycling?
I like both. Yeah, there's something. Swimming gives you the feeling of flying. It's kind of you have kind of the sense of you're free, you're floating, you're gliding over some materials. You're not touching the ground. So that has a liberating experience that comes with swimming to me. But then biking, particularly if you do road biking or push it hard, it's just the speed. I love that. Yeah.
What's one crazy event in your life that you would do all over again?
Oh, a lot of them. So one thing that pops up into my mind now is I once studied at a school. A friend of mine and two other students, we locked down an entire castle from the outside and the inside. And in the castle, usually the classes would meet. So we locked it down from the inside so that people who lived in the castle could not get out of their apartments. And people who would need in the morning go to class and take classes would not be able to go in there. So we locked that down. It took us about 8 hours to finish the jobs, and it took us about 3 months of preparation because we needed to cut wood and kind of. So we, in the end, we were able to lock down the castle, and that was just silly, exciting. We got, of course, punished, but it was every punishment worth.
Wow, that's wild.
Thank you, Oliver, and thanks to everyone else as well for this time getting to know our guest. I am intrigued about this conversation. I'm intrigued about the topic, but especially tonight, Oliver has some unique insights from his research, from the way his mind works, and understands the concept and this topic in the Bible. In the first episode with Dr. Kenneth Berglund, we learned that when he did some research in the Bible about God's presence, he found over 2,000 hits on that concept. And so clearly it's a theme that's prevalent in scripture, God's presence, but there is probably more to, this is a very complex topic, a very complex discussion that we can tackle from different angles. And so tonight we'll just start with a broad question and see where the conversation goes, where it intersects with our interests and your research, Oliver. And so to open up the discussion, I would just ask, how do you relate to this topic of God as presence?
Yeah. I guess in one way or another, we all are faced, particularly if you have grown up in a religious community, with this question: how is God present to you? And so it was an important question for me too. First, unrecognized. So I remember when I think was 13, 14, I really started with developing a routine in my spiritual life. So I would wake up early in the morning, about 6 o'clock or so, and would start reading scripture, and I would be allowed to get access to my father's library and read commentaries and make progress in my reading. I really liked it. I really experienced a huge satisfaction in this, and I did this for several years each morning, and sometimes almost got addicted to it. So like when I would come home from school, I would need to continue reading and figure out this thing with the help of some commentaries. But what I always realized is that the way how sometimes in the Christian church people speak about God's presence, I didn't experience. So I never heard God speak to me. I never experienced really God answer my prayers. I never experienced kind of a warm feeling of his presence or so. But I also didn't, I was not disappointed about this lack of experience, because these morning worship moments were to me just the thing. It fulfilled me with so much meaning. It was just later when we started I went to public high school, really good high schools. I think I would again do that. But we were exposed to Feuerbach, Marx, Freud, and these religious critics. both in literary classes, in religion classes, and biology classes, and so on, that I received a kind of a critical perspective on what my own religious community was doing, and I myself, and realized that actually much of what they were saying does apply. It actually is true that much of our religious activities, even our prayers, our fasting, and so on, is more a product of wishful thinking. The kind of God we pray to is often an idol of our own projections. So, and so at that moment, I started wondering, is God actually present, or is that presence that we think just a fiction, a self-produced, reality? So, and I was able to still kind of keep these two worlds separate, the world of criticism and then my own religious life. I got baptized when I was 18 in Europe, where I come from. It's usually normal that you get baptized in a later stage. So 18 is a perfect day because it's a year, it's the moment of adulthood, also in Germany, and you get your driver's license. And so for me, it was clear, yes, I want to live a life with God. I got baptized with 18, but awkwardly, a year later, I have lost faith. I was, the criticism that I learned in school took over, made sense. I allowed it actually to develop all its power and its might. And at that moment, there was for me no reasonable foundation to authentically live a life with God anymore, because life with God was just an illusion. God is a fiction. His presence is much more a projection of the human mind than it is real. And I was living in that state for about 4 or 5 years or so. And that's this question that you're asking about how I relate to the topic of presence comes close to my, or is part of my biography. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in my mind, there are lots of questions that come up right now. But Javi, go ahead.
I really think that I resonated some with what you said. His presence is the projection of the human mind, because in my head, then what is our meter to know if the present does exist? Because
right.
I think that's the logical question to ask ourselves. Because you hit a point, you marked that people conglomerate projections of God because of their emotions, which are highly subjective. So you can't really hold that to meter, because there's millions and billions of people in the world, and everyone feels a different way, and the way that they connect looks different as well, even within just emotions. And then we have the rational, critical side too, which I've been trying to step more into, and discover which one I lead in my life, one or the other, right? And this rational and critical side can also take over, like you stated. And so my question is, if could it be both? Could it be emotional and a rational perspective when you get to discover what the presence of God looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's both. Let's say the creation of God, if we want to phrase it that way, the creation of God is nurtured by both an experience of dissatisfaction in life, so the hope of a better world, so to say. But on the other way, also it's the creation of God is nurtured by our longing to have a coherent picture. That's the rational side, so to say, a picture that is not contradictory, a picture that fits. So, and so also rationality, also the mind is involved in our creation of God or gods, depending on your background. But both can create an illusion, both reason as well as emotion. And when they partner, they create strong illusions. Because it's difficult. Think about conspiracy theories as they are going around right now. Those conspiracy theories are so strong because they're so rational. They are so coherent often. They make sense. So, and if you try to undermine them, there's always a good rational reason why that attempt to undermine them itself is part of the conspiracy. So, and this is century, particularly Marx and Feuerbach and Freud were discovering. So that just because something is rational, it doesn't mean that it's real.
Right.
Most of your dreams are very rational, so they make sense. It's sometimes you yourself, in the dream yourself, you wonder, is this real or is this not real? It makes sense. So yeah.
Oliver,
So which brings us even to the darker place, you could say, because we lived for a while in the illusion that emotions are subjective, right? We cannot trust emotions and our longings, they're subjective. But then fortunately we have reason. So praise the Lord, so to say, we have reason. And with reason, we can filter out which emotions are valid, which emotions are real, and which are just illusionary. And then we find out with the thinkers that I just referred to, but many others, that actually reason itself is not a mean to access reality. So at least not a trustworthy mean to access reality. You can make very reasonable, rational ideas and find out later that they were actually not true. So so now we're really lost. And that was kind of my experience after I graduated from high school. It was basically the epistemological question: can we know? Can I know? If I cannot know, then I'm completely detached from anything that is trustworthy, that's meaningful, that's reliable. So and this humility that kind of grows out of this brings you to a super dark place that many people have referred to as madness, or Abraham Heschel as horror, and so on. It was actually just the fact that I was able to get access to some books and some thoughts of religious, faithful people, like Jewish people like Abraham Heschel, who themselves admit that we're living in the state of horror. And if you can be having a faith in God or in Yahweh, and at the same time admit that Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud are right, then for me there was kind of this opening. Perhaps there's a way for me to have a relationship with God by not just trying to defeat Feuerbach, Marx, and Freud. They have their right place, and they are voices that we need to listen to. But at the same time, I'm still able to have a relationship with God. So how is that possible? That's kind of the route that I had to follow then.
okay. I mean, I could ask like 10 questions or comments. But just to begin with, I guess my experience has been different. So I'm listening to you, trying to understand where you're coming from, because I cannot relate to it in that kind of experience. Also with my understanding of God's presence and my experience of God's presence, and with the relationship between the emotional and irrational. And I lean towards thinking that that's still a heritage of Greek philosophy, where emotional is submitted to the rational. For me, it has not been that kind of experience. And I think it's especially complicated because we talk about a transcendent reality. God is a transcendent reality. So whether it's emotional reason that best or first gives us access to that, for me, that's debatable, but maybe it's more of a personal experience. But we cannot go into that too much right now because we want to stay on the topic. So God's presence in your life, you mentioned something early on that I'm still intrigued about, that you never, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so maybe trying to rephrase, you never experienced God's presence in the way it's talked about in the church. Is that how you phrase it? Or
yeah, so perhaps let me give you an example. So on a Sabbath morning, usually in the type of churches that I went to, you would have this moment of testimony. And I'm not sure, perhaps you have that in your local churches too, but it's just, I think it was just before the mission report or after the mission report, there was this moment of testimony where the community was invited to tell them what prayers were answered, and where they felt God's presence in a sense. And in the beginning, as a 14, 15-year-old boy, you think, wow, God really answers prayer, it seems. So, and then, you learn at school, and then you realize that actually you could also perceive this just as a coincidence. So we have statistics. I mean, there have many research has been done on whether prayers are actually answered effectively. So the last statistics were compiled by John Heath on that. And what they found out, that prayer doesn't make any difference with regards to, I mean, it's masses of people, thousands of Christians that were, data was collected, and prayers are not answered more often than coincidences appear to answer wishes. So, when you learn these, and when you learn these statistics, then you start wondering, do we live in an illusion then? This is an example of where I felt like, no, number one, I knew God does not answer my prayers. I didn't feel him fulfilling my wishes or so. And I didn't have a problem with that, like I stated, because my spiritual life, my worship life was so meaningful. I didn't need a God who answers my needs or prayers. I felt like those needs will be covered when the Lord comes, so that's all good. But then in church, I realized that there is kind of this religion that expects God to answer prayers, and when it happens, then there's a great worship ceremony created around it. But then with the background, you realize, hey, wait, this was just a coincidence. Why is this coincidence now attributed to God answering? These kind of things. I'm not saying that it was a coincidence, but in the state of my life, for me, there was no measurable way to identify one thing as being a coincidence while the other thing is an answer to prayer.
Yeah, that's interesting, because to some extent, I don't know if we can answer that question. How do you measure someone else's experience, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But often we portray in church a reality that it is measurable. And when we push this, it's measurable. Look here and us, and there a miracle, and here and there. And then you look at, let's say, if it's really measurable, then you are inclined to think, okay, let's do the measurement then. Let's compile all the data and let's see. And then you realize, oh, actually, on the measurement front, there is no advantage in praying to God. So why then do I pray to God? So if measure on a measurable front, on an empirical data level, there is not any benefit. So why do I pray? I must confess, I still pray, but I pray for different purposes. I don't pray anymore because I think I have a high advantage of having my prayers fulfilled.
See, now I'd be very curious how these empirical studies would measure my experiences, because I have some that I don't think they could do justice by just the tools of empiricism, if that makes sense.
Right.
But I hear what you're saying.
Yeah. But to perhaps to bring it a little bit closer against to the biblical testimony, so away from my testimony and your testimonies, back to the biblical testimony, what really helped me find a foot back into the realm of faith was the fact that when reading scripture, I hear exactly the same voices of those great religious critics. So think of, I'm a Jeremiah scholar. Jeremiah chapter 7 is the so-called temple sermon. People go to the temple. That's Jeremiah. Actually, it's a sermon of God that Jeremiah is supposed to preach. And Jeremiah says, or God says to Jeremiah, I see these people go to church, and or to the temple back then. They go to the temple, they go to the church, and they sing all these songs about the grace of the Lord and the loving kindness of the Lord, the faithfulness of the Lord. And there's actually a hymn that they sing, and it's recorded in Jeremiah 7. It's called Hechal, Hechal, Hechal. It's like the presence of the Lord, the presence of the Lord, the presence of the Lord is with us. We are invincible. So, right, the Lord is with us. Praises be to the Lord. And then God says, it's the Hebrew term that's used, it sounds even more harsh than the English. It's sheker, 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 which means it's a lie. All what they're performing in the church about the presence of God is an illusion. So that's got judgment on it. And thought, hey, wait, I have read that before. I have read that with Feuerbach. Feuerbach has his famous statements, all theology is anthropology. So, and that made me really open my eyes and say, hey, wait, perhaps it's not just either they are wrong and the Bible is right. Perhaps both are right, and they both have something. Or think about Ezekiel in his chapter 10. He describes how God leaves the temple. He's not there anymore, but people still go to the temple and worship his presence. So, and he says, but he's not there anymore. They are living in an illusion. So, or think about the New Testament. Jesus is the greatest religious critic in a sense. You know, I mean, there are many examples. Think about the rich young man. Is that how you say it in English? The rich young man says, "How can I get eternal life?" And then Jesus says, "Well, keep all the commandments." And the question itself is already intriguing. So his religiosity, his spirituality has a purpose. He is economically invested into this. So the reason why he's religious is because he wants to get this eternal life. That's what he wants. And he's serious about this, because when Jesus says you have to keep all commandments, then he says, I do that already. So you see, he's really performing an extremely optimal religious life, but he does it for the sake of extending his life. And this is deconstructed by Jesus. This is not how you know, the one who is really spiritual gives his life, is willing to bring his life to an end. And much of, I think, our own religiosity, and I'm sure you can relate to that. I'm wondering actually whether you can relate to that yourself in one way or another in your personal life or in church communities, that sometimes people become Christians or continue to be Christians because they want to have the goodie. And this is false religion, I would argue. But what do you think? So how can you relate to this, or am I off? Or I'm just curious.
No, I think what you're stating is actually very reasonable, especially in a what I like to call Enneagram 3 society. Enneagram 3 is known as performer, workaholics, goal-oriented people. That's kind of like what I think the United States looks like nowadays, where we're very much, whatever we do, we have an angle to it. And that has infiltrated the church a lot. I think you hit some key points when you said that. And what blew my mind, and you tied it to Ezekiel and you tied it to Jeremiah, which I actually have a tidbit to Jeremiah, but you said essentially what you're seeing that has happened in the past in the Old Testament thousands of years ago is happening today in our current churches, where people are over celebrating the answers that are coming from God. I mean, I've been in church in my local Spanish church, and I know that they have moments for, like, they get up and they're like, God did this and he did this and this and did this. And I think it almost seems sometimes like we're trying to prove something. And usually they say, you know, right, like, you know how confident a person is when they don't have to say anything. They're just about it, right? And I wonder, like, and another thing that really caught my attention that you said was your spiritual and worship experience was enough. And
Right,
I think that that's really where it hits the key point, where it's like, how can we know God's presence when you know his presence for yourself? And I think it's when you honestly start to recognize, in my opinion, it's when you start recognizing what kingdom culture is about. It's the culture of giving versus receiving, not a transactional God, but a relational Father. And so that's kind of like where I've developed my train of thinking over time. And I think the other thing that stood out to me the most was you talked about something that I like to term liminal space, right? The moment in time where you're not sure about a lot of things, and that's okay. And Jeremiah is all about that. It's full of doubt. But doubt does not minimize your faith.
Exactly.
And I think we talked about this the other day in our season 1, where you started going in on how for us to start wanting to discover something, we have to be okay with experiencing the pain. For us to want to discover something that's bigger outside of ourselves, we have to have a big hurt. And that's when we start asking questions, existential questions like, who am I? Is there someone out there who cares about me? Is there more than what I'm seeing? When we start feeling that pain, we start asking these questions, and then God can actually come into the picture. And so I guess to tap it all off, my question would be like, because I still have the same question, right? What's our meter? What's our meter for knowing the presence of God?
Yeah. So perhaps two things, Javi. So the one thing I think I learned for myself, and I learned in my assessment of kind of religious experience in general, is the more we stress something, the more we subconsciously reveal that we don't have what we stress. about. So for example, let's say there's a couple who is married, and you know, married couples come together, have a conversation about their married life, and this married couple says, you know, our marriage is so great, you know, we love each other and we hardly have any conflicts, and they push this kind of description analysis of their own marriage. The critical listener knows it's probably the reverse. So it's probably that they struggle a lot, but they cannot admit it. And often I have kind of this feeling for those religious communities or persons that stress very much how present God is in their life. I wonder, perhaps it's a reflex upon this absence of God that they experience in life, that every little sign that they could detect as a sign of presence, and even if it's just random or you know, it is mentioned. So that makes me curious, because in the biblical text, as you, Javi, were hinting at, there is a well, perhaps celebration would be the wrong word, but there is a revelation, an opening up of the fact that God is not present. So think about the Psalms, you know, struggling with God. I pray, and you're not listening. So God, I'm looking for you, I'm looking for you, I'm looking for you, and I cannot find you. So, or then think of an entire book is written in the Old Testament, Lamentations. It's 5 chapters, all just mourning, in a sense, the absence of God. So there's just in the middle of the chapter 3, there are 2 verses that could be read as positive, and then again it's in the negative and say, Lord, I'm struggling. Why do you not help me? Don't you see me? So, and I think this is an essential part of biblical faith, namely to not try to overcome your doubts and to overcome your questions by kind of tricking your mind and your psyche with some fancy strategies, but to have both stand there. My doubt and the awareness that God cares. So, which then brings us to the second question: how do we measure that God cares, right? Is there any way for us to measure that? Yeah.
So I have a quick comment, and then I want to hear something from Aaron, not Aaron, Joseph and Adrian. Sorry, Adrian, because you've been silent, and I'm curious what you're thinking about this. But I'm probably the counterpoint to this conversation so far, and I continue to be in that trajectory because I think just my experience is different. I think it gets really tricky when we start to read motives in other people. It's helpful to have categories of explanations where every one of us could try to look into ourselves and say, well, is this what I'm really doing, or is this maybe what I may be doing? So I think it's helpful to have different perspectives from where to analyze ourselves. But I would not place I would not make these categories too narrow, if you know what I mean. Just because it's really hard to measure from the outside someone's experience with a transcendent reality, that there is limited, that we have limited tools to measure in some way. And so, for example, what I have experienced God's presence a number of times, I feel like in many ways He's present with me in different ways, in many situations. I think He's leading in specific ways, and sometimes not in specific ways, but sometimes in very clear ways. I rarely talk about my testimony, but when I do share it, I give credit to God, because if I cannot say this is me because I know it's not me. It would be like lying to God or lying to people to say that this has been my call when I believe it was God's. So it's a matter of honesty to what I perceive to be my reality. But I don't know if we have time to delve into the different aspects of that.
So perhaps, Alina, to not let's say to not to state perhaps clearer what I mean is, I think and respect your experience, and there's experience of many, and myself included, is I think what we can learn in the biblical text and by the biblical prophets is that you always should reflect upon your own religiosity. So I think that's what you learn. So and when you do this, you will come to the conclusion that some experience you have had are only to be authored or only to be origined in the merciful God who is acting really up on you. So, and some experience you will discover as, oh, that was actually not God, that was my wishful thinking. So these were my own projections. So I think faith in God really challenges you to critically reflect your own religiosity, how much of your own religious life is idolatry. But that reflection is not there in order to deconstruct faith and to deconstruct the presence of God and to deconstruct that God does do something, sometimes here and there, something in this life. So, but to rather make this shine even stronger. So I give you an example of a biblical hero, one of the ark fathers, Jacob. So, Jacob lives a life where he's a trickster, right? That's the very name of, or the meaning of his name, Yaakov. So he's kind of this trickster. So, and he tricks, so to say, he tricks the presence of the Lord into his life. He makes a lot of amazing profit by tricking, or we would call this today, how do you call it? Divination, through divinational means. Think about what he did with these animals, the mixing of the animals, and then he was able to. So he has these tricks, and these tricks make him think that God is on him, that God is with him, that God blesses him. So, and so he kind of controls God in his religious life. He's probably not thinking bad about it. So he thinks this is just, I have a relationship with God. That's why I'm so successful. So God answers my prayers, so to say. I mean, it's a simplification of his life here that I'm portraying. But the interesting thing is, then he has this encounter in Genesis 32. And he fights a man he thinks is his enemy. So you say he fights a man he thinks is the opposite of the God he worships. Right? Because the God he worships, he's with him, he's protecting him, he's blessing him, and so on. And now there is the antithesis to this God. He's actually threatening his life. There's this other guy who wants to kill him. And so he fights back, and he fights back, and he fights back. And interesting, the word that is used here in Hebrew for this fighting, akaf, that it only appears 2 times here in the Old Testament. It's not a very popularly used word, but it's used because it has such, most scholars agree on this, it has the sound of that wrestling, what the English translates as wrestling, is very similar to the sound of his name, Yaakov, Aakaf, Yaakov, and that whole thing takes place at the Yaabok, at the river Yaabok. So it's all about his identity, and so what happens is, in this fight, God challenges his identity, his religiosity, his beliefs that God is with him in the way he thinks he is with him. So, and then we know what it is, what happens in the end. He gets this hit and he realizes, I was actually fighting God himself, and I have no chance to overcome this God. I mean, he just does a little slap and there I am. So there's another perspective to it too, because God himself says, I cannot overcome this guy, right? But that's a different topic. Anyway, so what happens is, at the moment where he realizes that his enemy, the antithesis of his God, is God himself, then he is receiving a moment of blessing and grace. His word, his name becomes Israel, right? God fights. And I think this is my experience, and the Old Testament type of experience of your believing God. God is a fighter against you. So Yisrael means God fights. God fights you. So not to be against you, but to be with you, to clarify your own religious experience and to come closer and draw closer to God. So some psychiatrists who have studied this, they call this the traumatic experience of religion. So often we debunk religion as being a projection of self-seeking emotions. But in the Bible, we find a picture that often contradicts this image of we're just on our trip of self-seeking emotions. It's a traumatic experience. God fights you. And this is a blessing because he purifies your own idolatries, so to say. He purifies your religion. And I think this is my experience of God. I'm always interested in, when I'm studying the text, in those things that don't fall into my paradigm, in those things that don't support my assumptions, because I think this is a moment of revelation. This is a moment of God fighting me. And now I want to invest into this fight. I want to get insights, new insights about what God wants to tell me, where I'm wrong in my theology and where I should move forward.
Oh, I would love to see a book one day on that touches on different characters of the Bible and how they experience God's presence, because it seems that it's probably a unique experience in each one, in each situation. And in that sense, we also relate probably differently to different characters. But this one is an intriguing one for sure, with Jacob discovering God's presence in a more real way when he initially thought he had God's presence and blessing in his life. Joseph and what?
Sorry, let me just say two things to finish this up, and then I'm curious about Joseph and Adrian. But you know, when Jacob is out of the fight, he says, I have to give this place a name. Mm-hmm. And the name he gives is Penuel. It means the face of God. So he encountered the face of God. But the irony is he never saw his face. So the irony is because God says, I need to leave, right? Because the morning is coming. You cannot see my face, because we know from Exodus 33, you cannot see the face of God. So then you're done. So you're dead. So at the moment where that is actually said, Jacob realizes this is God. So he says, I was fighting face to face with God. And I think an idolatrous reading would mean it's possible to be face to face with God and see him. But that's not what Jacob meant. Jacob meant, I didn't see him, but he was with me. So, and you find an earlier instance of this in Genesis 28, where you have this dream. Jacob has this dream, and he wakes up, and then he gives this place a name. He says, this is Bethel, it's house of God. It's basically the temple. So he realizes that in this very normal, random location, that's so much different than a temple. This is actually the temple. So, and I think that relates to my own religious experience, where we think it is at that spot where the presence of God is more intense. It might be wrong. It might be where you don't expect the presence of God, where you realize he was actually there. But okay, so I'm sorry. I stopped talking now. Yeah.
No, thank you.
Well, my comments from just hearing all of these things is that it's hard to determine the presence of God in the moment, because like you were saying, your perceptions, your reasoning is not always reality. And it was actually mentioned in a previous episode in this season, but when you look back at the experiences in your life and you just kind of analyze them, you can see how God was working back then, even though you didn't realize it. So, and then kind of relating to what Hobby said about how to measure God's presence, I don't really think you can measure God's presence in the moment, because your understanding of how God is working is not going to work, because God's ways are far above our ways, and we cannot understand how he moves and how he works. So I would say it's probably the wrong thing to try to measure how close you are to God or how close he is to you, because it's not for us to understand. It's for God to just work in our lives and to move, and he will always be there with us, because he says he will always be with us. So we don't have to worry that he has left or that we are leaving him, because he will always come back and seek us. And I suppose a question I have is, when a group of people come together and some people feel God's presence, is it wrong to say that God is only there for them and not specifically with you? Because I was trying to relate previously in the conversation to God's presence in the Old Testament, and I was thinking of the prophets, because usually the prophets are there because the people of Israel are not doing what God intended for them to do, and so they're there to kind of guide people back to God so that God's presence can return, like you said, Ezekiel, so God can return to the temple. But in instances where we assume God's presence was with them, which is like when they're prospering, such as during the reigns of David and Solomon, there were still prophets in Israel. So is it like, how can we gauge that if God is blessing us, but yet there are people there to guide us back to him? Does it mean that he's truly there? Or is it somewhat more of God is with you, but bad things still happen? Yeah, God is there.
Yeah, that's a good one. So Adrian, what do you think when Joseph is putting this question to the floor. Do you say we have to refine Joseph's question a bit, or should we attack it right away?
We can attack it. I have another kind of thought. Maybe it relates to it, but I was just wondering.
Okay, I was just wondering because you looked so interested to his way of phrasing the question.
Well, that's probably why.
Okay. So, well, two things that come into my mind. The first thing is one of the most prosperous times of the nation of Israel are not reported in the Bible. It's the time of Omri. So you could argue, hey man, that's where the kingdom grew and where the GDP was the highest and so on. Isn't that a sign for God's presence? So I think the Bible probably two or three verses just on, basically it says Omri was the king. That's it. I'm done. So, and then Ahab comes, the story of Ahab, and there is a famine, right? His son, a famine. So it's in the famine where God is more present, you could argue, than he was actually in the prosperous times. So therefore, the whole project to measure kind of presence of God is at least cannot be done according to the economic measurements that we usually like to apply. So a second thing is that God is present for us is, according to biblical thinking, measured by how we are present to him. So let me say that again. So when we speak about presence, we have the idea that there is one element, another element, and they are in contact with each other, right? That's presence. So they are present to each other. And so if this is a human being and this is God, then we say God is present, it means that we are aware of him being present, right? And it's this awareness that often is compromised in our experience of life. So we don't feel that presence, whatever we mean by presence. So we feel more his absence. So, but I think powerful thing that the prophets declare or explain to us is that actually at each moment where we felt the absence of God, we were present to him. So I can give you two examples of this. The first examples, you find that also in Jeremiah chapter 2. So where God remembers the presence of his people through the desert. So, and often the people in the desert complain about the absence of God, so to say, right? I mean, of course there are miracles and so on, but why are we still not blessed? Why are we still not in the land? And we want better food, and where's God? And so on. So, but then in God's memory, in Jeremiah 2, it's like, I memorize every day, and you were with me. So, and this is just one example. The second example, which is much more powerful, and that's one reason why I'm an Adventist, is that as Adventist Christians, we believe in a judgment, and that judgment is quite a big ceremony. It has its own rituals, and one of those rituals is, I'm sure you guys can refer to it as you grow up in the church, is this opening of the book of life, right? This kind of this judgment scene, the opening of the book of life. And what we know from ancient research in ancient Eastern religious texts, as well as research in the biblical texts, is that actually this book of life is not, as some Christians think, a list of all your wrongs, right? Or a list of all your goods to kind of see how is the scale tipping over. Is it more tipping to the bad or tipping to the good? And if it's more tipping to the good, well, then you're lucky, you made it. Or tipping to the bad, well, then you're unlucky and goodbye. So no, actually what this book of life contains is, to use the vocabulary we're using here now, it's your presence for God. So it's the story of your life as it came to God. So as God participates in your life, he writes your story. It's your biography. It's like the way how we read Abraham's story. That will be Adrian's story. Adrian will be able to read his story. So from a God-eye perspective, and as you read your story, or as Javi reads her story, you will see that in each moment you were present to God. So he did not forget a single day, a single second. He recorded everything. He knows exactly what's happened. He knows your confusion. He knows what type of experience in the past, what traumas have led you to become the sinner that you are. So he realizes that, and he will talk to the Satan and say, you cannot blame Adrian for that. Yes, it was wrong, but hey, see the big picture. I have written it down. He was present to me. And look what happened, you know, in, I don't know, at school or, you know, at home or there are much more factors involved in Adrian's failing and in my failing as Oliver. So don't blame Oliver for doing something wrong only. You need to see the big picture. And Satan, I reject your accusation. So I have the whole story. He was present to me all the way. So that's one big contribution of biblical thinking to the topic of presence. It often is not that we feel his presence. Often our default experience might be his absence, and Adventist thinking stresses this. God is gone, Jesus is gone. The only thing that we have is the Spirit, right? And the Spirit is just a comforter because we are crying because of his absence. So we are waiting for his presence. But in all the experience of his absence, God is active to make you present to him. And that's, to me, a huge comfort and a reason why I'm an Adventist, a passionate one. Adrian, you had you were wanted to chime in, or what was that?
Sure, I might need some help deciphering my thought, but something that was coming to mind, I guess, throughout this discussion was that when I was reflecting on my own spiritual life, and I was wondering if I seek just the hand of God, rather like his blessings, rather than like seeking the face of God. And some things brought that up to mind, which was when you were comparing when you grew up in reading all these things, and that kind of was sufficient for your spiritual life. And you contrasted it with the church, that they projected another way of experiencing God, which is they felt his presence, or they were like answered prayer requests or answered prayers, and there was a celebration behind that. I was wondering if seeking the hand of God plays a role versus seeking the face of God.
Yeah. You know, one reason why I returned to a life of faith was one conversation partner that God allowed me to have, which made me more hopeful that a faith with God is possible, a walk with God is possible, is the dissertation that Abraham Heschel wrote in, I think it's in the 1930s. So it's called Das prophetische Bewusstsein, prophetic consciousness. And I think it contributes very well to the conversation we are having, because what I've heard earlier, I think, to Abraham Heschel saying the situation we're living in is horrific, because we cannot even trust our own faith. Our problem is not so much whether God exists or not. Our problem is whether our knowing or our thinking and our ambitions are trustworthy. So we cannot even trust ourselves. So you know, why did I marry my wife? Was it because she looked so beautiful? Well, then perhaps that was not the best decision. So because that's not real love. But I really loved her. So why, you know, and at the moment where you start reflecting about yourself, you often come to this moment that I do not even know why I love her. I don't even know why I married her. Am I on a safe place? And in this kind of self-investigation, you hopefully, when you do that together with a good God, then Jesus brings you to a beautiful space where you can start investing into that love again. But Abraham Heschel finds himself in this problem of saying, hey, all these other religions, they are illusions, they are projections. Marx, Feuerbach, and whoever they are called, they are right. But why is Yahweh not also just another projection of mankind? Right? Why he's not just another product of human creativity? And then he this dissertation, das prophetische Bewusstsein, prophetic consciousness, and he describes the apparent differences between pagan religions, so to say, and Yahweh faith. And you find extreme differences there. For example, in the typical pagan religions, there is an obsession with seeking God. They are rituals that you can perform in order to make God present. Singing, dancing, drugs, fasting. There are many types of methods that the pagan religions applied to create a sense of the transcendence of God being present. Heschel, you should read it. Heschel writes this in very good descriptive ways. So now on the other side, how is Yahweh faith? The Bible usually reports that nobody is looking for God, right? God just appears, unexpected. All of a sudden there's this dream. So that's the default. There is no method to bring God close. So God comes on his own terms. And when he comes, then he's really there, because then you know it was not my self-seeking emotions who produced this experience. In fact, usually when he comes, it's a traumatic experience. Jeremiah says, go away, right? You know, that this is, I don't want your presence. It's a horror to my life. Or I've eaten your words and my stomach, I have diarrhea now. So it's not a good experience. So intrinsically in the prophetic critique of religion is this suspicion that when persons are significantly investing into methods of religiosity, they might actually live an idolatrous life. So, but the powerful message of the prophets is that even in the idols we pray to, God can communicate himself. So God can show himself, like the example of Jacob. He lives kind of in a life of a fictive God, but God fights Jacob. God fights his own religion. Karl Barth has this formulation, Revelation, also Offenbarung hebt Religion auf. So it means a revelation does not abandon religious life. Revelation takes your religious life, filters it, and transforms it into something better, into something that is more close to God. So always stay critical towards your own spiritual and religious life. It will help you to become more spiritual in a sense, more purified.
I have a question then regarding that, because something you mentioned about the pagan religions, how they were always actively trying to seek God, and you mentioned fasting. In my personal life, I never really understood why people fasted, because personally, I like to eat food. And so if I'm deprived of food, I'm going to be upset. And if I have like a mindset of being upset, then God is like the last thing that I want to be involved with. So then, and even like the Pharisees, like how Jesus always condemned them for, you know, fasting 2 times a day, imposing those 2 times a week, imposing those things on other people. So, and when I see people in the church, like, oh, they fast, or they might do other things that kind of bring them closer to God, should I not do those things then? Because if that's not how I feel like I connect to God, then should I put away all those things? And there was something else I had, but it slipped me. But that's just my main question. Like, do I need to actively seek God, or just read the Bible and just do the things that God wants me to do, like Micah 6:8, actively help people in order to seek God?
Can I add to that, actually? Because I had a similar train of thought, but it wasn't so much it wasn't so much of a should I do this or should I emulate what other people have done. It was more in the realm of what are practical ways, now that because I agree with what we're saying, there shouldn't be a strategic method of getting closer to God. I think that if you step into prayer just because I need to be close and I need to be as spiritually as high as that, 60, 70, 80-year-old person at church who's Brother John's faith, we got to have Brother John's faith. I don't think we should try to emulate things in order to get closer and feel stronger, more connected to God. But I do think there is a sense of, what can we do to aid that spiritual growth? Not in order to be more firm that God's presence is with us, but to truly walk with God in his presence that's already among us. And because if what we're saying is God is tangibly and actively trying to get a hold of us in the sense of like trying to be present with us, whether we see it or not, what are things that I can do to recognize that presence? Because I think that faith is a recognition of what's already there. Even if we don't feel it, it's there, right? It's not a certainty seeking model, but more so a discovery, a journey. And when you enter that journey and that process of discovery, you have that faith because you decided, you made that choice anyway. So what are practical things that we can start shifting our mindset more to less of a transactional God, more of a relational relationship, and more of a less of a certainty seeking faith, and more of a okay with doubt and still having faith type of living?
So I think the challenge is to not throw out, how to say, the baby with the bathtub. Is that how you say it in English? So so fasting, prayer, these can be powerful tools in the context of religion as idolatry, right? So the more you pray, the more chances are that God will make himself present. That's the typical nature that Abraham Heschel also describes about idolatry. So so we manipulate, we can decide how much presence of God we want and how much not. So if you fast or if you pray because of such methodological concerns or strategic concerns, then you're on the wrong way. But now to say, so let's stop praying, let's stop fasting, and basically let's stop singing, let's stop going to church because that's all idolatry. That's also wrong. So you can be very kind. I can be very kind to my wife without me doing this as an expecting that she will be kind to me back. So when I be kind to my wife without the expectation that she returns something, then it's true kindness. So, and for me, this is prayer and fasting. I am praying. I'm a person who is heavily invested in spiritual rituals. So, but I don't expect them to be a mean towards manipulating God. For me, fasting is a moment where I declare to God, where I communicate to God that I feel his absence, that I'm starving for his presence, so that I'm wishing that he finally returns. I cannot longer live without him. So that's why I'm fasting. It's a biological, material exposition of my own despair, so to say. And as an Adventist, then my call and scream for God to return becomes louder. So that this is not being done as a as a tool to have him not make my grandmother die. So I don't take it as a strategy. For me, it's more an act of despair. So, and I know that in my act of despair, my praying and my meditating and my fasting, this act of despair will make God make me even more present. So he will sympathize with me. He will feel my angst and so on. And he feels like, for people like this pure guy, I need to return. So, but I have a good friend in Amsterdam. He's a cab driver. He's the most intelligent person I know. Very complicated life. He has been cursed by life in the true sense of the words, so to say. But he is a follower of Christ. He loves Christ. He in many episodes of his life, he would be far from what we would consider to be the lifestyle of an Adventist or a Christian. So, but if you see the big picture, you see he's a dear child of God. And he once said something that fits this conversation, I think. He said, God, Oliver, um, when God returns, I will cry. I will cry because I see that he keeps his promises, and he is the good God that I always believed. And even if he doesn't take me home, this is my last thought that I will have. So that he is good, that he's loving, and that he is worth this judgment, and that it was good that he didn't take me home. So when I heard that, it touched me deep, because basically what he said, all of his religiosity is not there because he wants to make the winning team. He wants to make it into the winning team. All of his religiosity is because he deeply understands and appreciates the truthfulness, the ethical authenticity of the Jesus that he has encountered. So I think we should not stop praying, and we should not stop fasting, and we should not stop, being moderate in our lifestyles, and stop. I think we should really stop eating meat and strive for a more healthy lifestyle, and do more exercise, and do more neighbor services, and all of this. I truly believe this, but as an act of dedication, as an act of passion, not as an act of a strategy or an act as an expectation. So it's the self-giving sacrifice by which you pray, by which you fast, by which you go vegan, by which you start working for a neighbor to neighbor, or the thrift store, or whatever it is. I think that's true spirituality, and that's what we should strive for.
I think I'm finally on the same page.
And not live in the illusion. So yeah, so think about the Sabbath. As Adventists, we keep the Sabbath, right? And often, if you listen to the prophets, you could say, some of us, some of myself, have kept the Sabbath as the right of the wrong Sunday, right? The Sunday worshippers are wrong, the Sabbath worshippers are right. So if something becomes a matter of I'm on the right side, the other on the wrong side, you might be already a victim of idolatry. So because idolatry is highly invested into who is absent and who is present, who is right and who is wrong. So it is this categorical definitions, which I would call images, Standbilder in German, the idols, they're static images. So, and you might be judged by God. You might be sent to exile even though you keep the Sabbath. In fact, that happened to Israel. They were sent 70 years into exile because they didn't keep the Sabbath. And then the people say, what do you mean? Jeremiah has a whole episode on this. Every week we celebrate the Sabbath. Every week on the Saturday, we stop working, we go to church, we do the ceremonies and everything. And Jeremiah says, no, I'm telling you, every week you go to Sabbath, the last 490 years you didn't keep it. And then what do you mean? Because the Sabbath does not just come in the weekly form, it comes in the 7-yearly form, it comes in every 50th year form, and none of that was celebrated. Nobody released his slaves on the 7th year. Nobody returned his land to the former owner after the 50th year. You didn't keep nothing. So your Sabbath became an idol. It became a legitimization of your self-seeking emotions. It is spirituality in disguise. So I reject it. 490 years you did it wrong, 70 years you go into exile. And sometimes I have the feeling about my own spirituality. I try to do the right thing because the others are wrong. And then I might find myself, perhaps I'm not a Sabbath keeper. Perhaps I'm not a Seventh Day Adventist. Perhaps just I am a pagan in disguise. So and I need to, again, come to terms with, I have to have this Jabok experience. God needs to fight me again. So yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I finally feel like I'm on the same page with this conversation, based on your last comment, Oliver, especially in regards to the way we control God. This is where I've seen it problematic, where we try to control God, where we want God's presence in a particular way, in a certain time of our lives. We want signs and things like that, for our own. Maybe the motive is good, because we want something good, but at the same time, God doesn't allow himself to be controlled. Like he needs, just like in any relationship, control is not
Right.
should not be part of that relationship. The same is with God. He doesn't let himself be fooled by us, with our appearance of desire, if you want. So I totally relate with that, just based on experiences that I've heard. I think that's problematic and it's dangerous. That can lead to all sorts of issues with God, including idolatry, like the way you're expressing it, and illusions and things like that. Or ultimately, when God doesn't show up in the way you want him, you can just discard of him. You're like, well, he's not present, so he doesn't exist. So therefore,
Right.
um, I'm just gonna live my life without him. So I definitely really appreciate you inviting us into that kind of level of introspective depth of why are you doing the things you're doing? Are you taking the right approach to seeking God's presence? And it would be interesting for me, just as an exercise, to see in the Bible how many times God presence is his initiative and how often is humans initiative. And I'm guessing it's okay if it's humans initiative too, but the question is always, what's the purpose of that? Why are you asking for God's presence, and how are you asking for it? If you have any comments there, I would be curious. And then maybe we're running over time, but I find it helpful for this conversation because it's so complex in some way. So maybe there's one more question, we can take that and then move into takeaways.
Yeah, I agree that this is complex. So, this cannot be done in one conversation and not in one series even. It takes a year, a lifetime also to kind of settle these issues a little bit more. But on the question of can we measure kind of in the Bible through research how much God speaks to man, and then how much man speaks to God, human beings speak to God. Yes, there is a way to measure it in a certain sense. So I'm speaking here only for the Old Testament now. You can measure it in the text as a text grammatical metric. And that is when a conversation is starting in biblical Hebrew, you have an explicit subject, like Adrian. Then you have the predicate speaks, and then you have an explicit indirect object, Joseph. So Adrian speaks to Joseph, or if it's narrative, Adrian spoke to Joseph. And then the direct speech comes, Adrian, blah, 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 blah. So, and then Joseph answers, right? And then what happens in the Hebrew text grammar, the answer is, it says, and he said. That's the only thing. So you see, there's no subject and there's no indirect object. Yeah, that's the default. It's just a normal in biblical Hebrew, because everybody knows after the speech of Adrian, the next one speaking is the answer, the one he was speaking to. So we can just say, and he said, and that's Joseph speaking. It's logical. It's Joseph speaking. So, so that a conversation is always initiated by an explicit subject and an explicit indirect object. The flow of the conversation doesn't need these explications anymore. So if you now go and say, find me all cases where human participants is a subject and God is an indirect object of a speech introduction, you'll find a handful, two handfuls of cases. So I think you find only one case or two cases where Moses actually speaks to God, or where he initiates the conversation. I'm now speaking just for the book of Exodus. Most of the times it's Adonai speaks to and then a human person. So that means the conversation starter in the Old Testament by default is God. There's hardly man or a woman or a man who starts the conversation with God. Human beings, they do respond to God's conversation starting, but it's not that a woman or man usually starts the conversation with God. There, where a human being is trying to establish a conversation with God, that human being is actually not, by the narrator, it's not being said that he or she speaks to God. So I think that's another sign for idolatry is going on. So that's not a conversation. He's not, or she's not speaking to God. So from purely metric perspective, yes, you can measure it. You can say the dominant message of the Old Testament is human beings don't speak to God. God speaks to human beings, and then human beings respond. They actually shocked, like, oh, wow, this was, that's the default. So God in search of man, rather than man in search of God, which I think stresses again this idea of that we are so much more present to God than he might be present to us in our subjective feelings. Yeah, that's on the metric. But we said perhaps there's another question that we could.
Yeah, maybe a quick last question and then takeaways.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm still trying to understand how to formulate it, but the example that I got my question from was Isaiah 7, where God tells King Ahaz to ask a sign from him. Why would God not just simply, because he's present, because he's speaking to Ahaz, but he's also telling Ahaz to ask a sign so he can verify God's presence more. So why does God do that, especially if he knows that Ahaz would say, no, I don't want a sign? Like, is he just giving us the opportunity to come closer to him and be more in his presence? Or is he doing that for his own benefit, to show people like, yeah, I tried to help him out, but he didn't want me, so now I'm just going to back off as God and let things play out on their own?
Yeah, that's a good one. So the way how I read this is that God wants to stimulate an introspection. So what do you really want? Tell me the sign that you really want. So you have a similar situation in the story of Abimelech and Abraham. You know, Abraham, he tells to his wife that she's his sister, and then Abimelech tries to marry her, and then we have all this mess and so on. And then when God appears to Abimelech, he says, you need to return it because otherwise you get killed. And by the way, he will pray for Abraham, will pray for you. And I'm always ask myself, if I would be Abraham, I messed up, right? In the whole story, Abimelech is a gentleman. If there's a Satan in the story, or if there's a, let's say, a sodomite in the story, it's Abraham. It's not Abimelech. Abimelech is the Jesus type of figure here. So if I am the one who messed up, and God tells me that I have to pray for the one who became my victim, so that God can restore and heal that person again that I damaged, I'd say that must be a terrible exercise. So for myself, so because I cannot say, God, please, Abimelech did something stupid, so forgive him. We all do stupid things, so forgive him and heal him. No, because this is not the truth, and that God knows that is not the truth. You say, God, I messed up. So when I now look into my own self, I see that what I thought Abimelech is, namely another sodomite, I am myself. I think this is the power of Christ on the cross. So when we look, why they put Christ on the cross? They put Christ on the cross because he was a criminal. He was not paying the taxes. He was flirting with all kinds of girls. He was with the criminals, and he needed to be crucified. He was the worst of all. And then you stand in front of the cross, and while you look at it, it shines back like a mirror, and you realize, I'm the one who compromises the taxes. I'm the one who is, all the time with these lofty girls. I'm the one who am an idolater and a cheater. I'm the one who, disadvantages even more the disadvantaged. And you realize you have crucified the wrong guy. So you should have been crucified. And at that moment, where you come to a full awareness of your own disaster, Ahaz, ask for a sign, right? And when you come to the full awareness of your own disaster, then this mirror that you're looking at shines back and said, you're forgiven. So you have now seen yourself go and do no more. So that's kind of my experience of God speaking through idols. It's this weird experience where you're praying to the God. I think when I pray to God, it's to a great extent my imagination. It's my projection of what I think God is. It's not the true God. So but then God can fight me back. Israel, right? God fights me back and said, I hear you anyways. And let's help further constructing your image of God so that you can become a more truthful God. That's for me kind of the experience at the cross. You need, as a Christian, I think you need a good portion of atheism in order to have a sanctified way of having faith. So these things, I could read you some quotes that would confirm that, but yeah, that's kind of what I think about this Asa sign. So sometimes these signs are there for you to come to terms. What do I really want? What sign do I actually want? And you realize, oh no, it's not that. Oh no, that sign I don't want. That's, oh shoot, I'm on the wrong track. Yeah.
Thank you. That makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Let me give you a quote here. So I think you will enjoy it. It's kind of from Cornelis Muscotta. I have it here in front of me. So where he says, when the gods were discovered to be mute, voiceless abysses, Israel was born. Or better, when Israel was born, when Israel's faith was awakened, the gods were unmasked, or idols, or religion, so to say, were unmasked as being nothing more than the utter silence, the total taciturnity which they had always been. Here, for the first time in the human mind, they emerged in a naive way what we today more learnedly assert as a theoretical statement. The Godhead is a projection of the human mind. At that moment, it was more than a thesis. It was a confession and a hymn. True, it is the negative reverse of a confession and a hymn, but the negative, that is this atheism, then gods are the projection of the mind, but the negative is such an essential part of the new recognition of Yahweh that it borrows some of its passion from this negativity. So let's embrace the religious critique so that we can come to more pure faith with God. So that's really the hymn that Israel was singing, because they deconstructed all these gods. Sun is not a god, moon is not a god, the waters are not a god. But then what is a god? Only then, when you are aware of your own self-seeking emotions, projecting faith, you can get exposure to the Christ on the cross.
Thank you so much, Oliver. So let's each share a takeaway from this conversation, and then I'll come back to you, Oliver, for some final words for our viewers.
I'll give the floor to Adrian and Joseph and then follow up with them.
Okay, I'll start. My takeaway would be that I really just have to search inside myself, understand my motives for why I desire God's presence. And then also, like you were saying, I need to sort of disbelieve my understandings so that I can relearn how to believe in God the correct way, and so that I can really know what it means to have God's presence.
Mm-hmm.
Powerful. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, very similar. I guess something practical that I would do would be question like the things that I wouldn't question myself, like, oh, I know this is true, or question the things I do, or because I think I got it right, but then take a step back and actually just ask, why do I do this? Is this what God wants me to do, or is this just what I think this is? What God, is this me, or is this is this God? So I guess, yeah, having that healthy critique of your religiosity, so that you're not stuck in this kind of blind state where you're kind of thinking everything else is wrong, but maybe perhaps there's something wrong in what your own kind of logic.
Yeah.
I think a critical beginning of a critical analysis with what you're thinking and contrasting that with who God is. I think it's been so important in my journey with God. But something that I do struggle with is feeling a lack of presence. And I mainly struggle with this because when usually this feeling happens, I stop trying to practice religious actions because I feel as if I'm not worthy enough at the moment to really come to God because I haven't been amounting or haven't been doing enough for Him. And that comes with like who I am as a person. I'm a doer over a beer. So being with God is actually really hard for me sometimes. But I think while I was hearing you guys speak, I wrote some things down. And I said, when it becomes the life of spiritual comparison, a genie in a bottle interaction with God, or a self-seeking construction of a mental image, then I may be a pagan in disguise. And I know that I've been in all of these places before. So something that keeps on coming back to my mind as we were talking was resting in God. I want to practice that. And I think what that looks like at this point is submitting the ways of living and acknowledge the doubt, like submitting those ways of living and then acknowledging that I do have doubt and that's okay. And having a receptive heart to allow God to establish His presence in my life rather than me trying to attempt or affirm His presence for me.
Yeah.
I want to practice what that looks like, resting more in God and still walking in that journey of asking these questions in the most foundationally free way possible.
Yeah. I think one becomes the best. I'm not sure whether I like the formulation. So, but you know, you have this popular saying to become the best version of yourself. I think you say that in English sometimes. So I'm not sure whether I agree with what the statement is supposed to say. But just for the purpose of this, let's say, I think the only way to become the best version of yourself is to not have fear. To not have fear of failure. So if you have fear of failure, you're not progressing. You're not going to progress. You can try again very hard, but within that trying to overcome, if that is motivated by I need to do this because otherwise I'm not accepted. If that's the motivation for it, if you're trying to change because you want to please, you're going to fail. You at least that's my experience. You're going to fail. You might have a strong will, perhaps stronger than others, and you might be able to, you know, establish the image of that you are actually making progress. But what I usually have seen in my own life and the life of others is they pushed hard and then they fail and they become prey of an even worse addiction. So, or whatever it is. So what I've learned, speaking as an Old Testament guy, that God wants human people to become the best version of themselves, of herself, of himself. And He knows the only way to, we call it the sanctified life, right? Sanctification. So the only way for you to make significant progress, and significant by the measures of God, not by your own measures. For some, finally, after 10 years giving up alcohol is a significant progress. For others, it might, to the outside, might look like, my goodness, 10 years. I mean, hello, this is a tenth of his life just for this little item. Can you not be a little bit more efficient? No. From God's perspective, think about Abraham. He records the story of Abraham. And the story of Abraham is a story where he's victorious, right? He's planting all these altars everywhere. And then he's failing badly. Like we just had that story about Abimelech. He's victorious again, an act of faith. Think about Isaac and the slaughtering, amazing. And then he's failing again. Up, down, up, down, up, down. This is his life. This is life. Now, if you want to say, well, perhaps there is kind of this positive total curve, right? Perhaps it's up, down, but totally there's an upside. I'm not sure whether you can measure that. Think about David. Is there really an upside? Perhaps there's more downside in the end. You know, in the end, he ends up with this little woman that warms up his bed. Or think about Abraham. He was monogam for most of his life, which is revealed after Sarah's death. In the Old Testament perspective, Abraham is holy, and so is David. And the reason why they are holy and David is why Abraham and David are holy is not because they were victorious more than they were falling, because probably in the end it's about 50-50 or so. The reason why they are holy is because when they were failing what they did, when they were failing, they said, I'm wrong and I'm not giving up my loyalties with God. So that's what holiness is. Holiness is defined at the moment where you are at the lowest of your life, where you have failed, where you feel the total absence of God, and you don't blame God for it. You say, God, I'm yours. I'm back on track. I did stupid. I don't want to repeat it. I probably will repeat it. I hate it. I'm back. So I'm yours. So, and that has a lot to do with presence, because some of our religious progress is idolatry. So, and at the moment where we reflect ourselves and bring our own illusions to the altar, to the cross, the Lord will say, don't be afraid. I won't reject you. So move on, I'm with you. So look at my books. I'm writing a whole book here on Jabe's life. You will read it. Wait a couple of years. You will read your own book. You will read your own biography, and you will see how much you were present to me. So you might have felt my absence, but you were always present to me. And that kind of keeps me motivated to try, error, move on, show my loyalty to the Lord without fear. Then sanctification is a positive experience.
Thank you. I guess if I could share a quick takeaway before we conclude the conversation would be the aspect of control, that we cannot control God. And God doesn't let himself be fooled into that kind of relationship, because he wants the best for us and the best of us. And the best of us transpires in a relationship of mutual respect and a mutual allowing each other to be free to pursue that relationship. And so I also enjoyed seeing in the Bible the pattern of God being present to people. I think in many ways that has been my experience, but I just wanted to mention that that doesn't mean it's easy. God's presence in your life will ask you to do things, will ask you to be a certain kind of person. It's always a process of transformation, and that's not comfortable and easy all the time. But I think the fact that he is present with you is what makes it all worth it. It really does makes it worth it. There is nothing that compares to that, even close. And so so that has been partly my experience, and I hope I encourage people to who haven't maybe experienced that to enter that kind of relationship with God, where God has the initiative and then we respond to him and see what happens. My friends, it's been an hour and a half. And so both to the discussion group and to our viewers, we thank you for your patience. It's definitely a complex topic. We touched on a number of aspects, but I think we've come to some conclusions, and that makes it helpful and worth it. So we appreciate your time watching this conversation. I hope you've been blessed. Our next guest will be Dr. Richard Davidson. Dr. Richard Davidson is J.N. Andrews Professor of Old Testament Interpretation at Andrews University. We'll continue the conversation about God's presence in the Old Testament, probably from a different angle. So I definitely encourage you to join that conversation as well. And Oliver, thank you. You've invited us to deep introspection. We need that. We welcome that. And I think if people take it to heart, it will really make a difference in their lives. And for the last couple minutes, I would ask you to please share some thoughts with our viewers about the topic of God's presence.
Yeah, I mean, one could go many avenues here now, and I think I would be excited to explore with you guys much more on this topic. But perhaps let me end, at least for this session with note on mission. So gospel, to bring Jesus to the people and his forgiveness and the message of his coming and so on. And what I've realized is that for a significant amount of my life, I have this is a confession moment, I've been apologetic. I've tried to defend my faith against. I have done that at school all the time because I was in public school. I have defended my faith against evolutionary theory, and I have defended my faith against Marx and Hegel, and defended my faith against Feuerbach, and I did kind of a mediocre job looking at it back. So I see I was psychologically invested, so to say, in this, and I think it was good for what it was for me, this apologetics. But I realized at the moment where I started working with people that my defense mechanisms, defending Adventism or defending Christianity, were not really fruitful. They did not bring me much further, nor did they help me prevent young people from leaving the church. So in fact, it even didn't prevent me from leaving the church. So I left the church with all these apologetics. I knew it. So I knew it fairly okay. So it was not a failure of apologetics, of my knowledge of apologetics, I think. What I realized is once I started to get involved into the self-examination, where I applied religious critique to my own faith experience and my own faith assumptions and my doctrines, I became so non-defensive. And my conversations with people became really authentic. I could actually listen to what they were saying. I no longer categorized and said, oh, that's typical, okay, that's category A, I need to pull in my this apologetic bazooka, and then this is done. So, and oh, that's category C, oh, I have this other bazooka, and then you shoot at it. No, I was able to now listen to them and realize they are onto something. They are onto something. Actually, speak longer, speak longer, speak longer. Your critique of me, yes, it has a place. It has a place. And so while I give recognition to this critique, not giving up in the end my faith, nevertheless, that made people interested in who I am, in what my faith is. Because if in the end something remains, making me still pray to Adonai and fast and so on, and the critique was valid too, then there must be so much more than what the critique was targeting. And I think this is a takeaway for me that I would really like to encourage you guys. I know you probably are going to become professional, church workers. I would say don't invest in, at least not for everybody, don't invest into what we got known as apologetics. I think if you truly have a relationship with God, you're not afraid of criticism. In fact, you will invite criticism so that your faith will become even better, will become even more true, will become even more authentic. Yeah, that would be perhaps a final word here for so far from my side.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Oliver, for sharing, and thank you, Hobby and Adrian and Joseph, for your presence and your participation. This was a rich discussion. I hope our viewers will be interested in spending the time with us and learning from our reflections. And so I hope you have a good week, and I hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.